Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emma McAuley, and I'm from Dublin in Ireland. So I've come a fair distance to be here today. And first of all, I would like to thank Dana Mulvaney and the Hearing Loss Association. So, it's an honour for me to be here today, and I feel very humbled after spending the last 4 days of listening to a lot of experts in the fields of audiology and people with hearing loss and loop experts. So I'm really just going to talk about the Irish perspective, or rather my perspective, as somebody who is coming from 3 different angles. Okay. So basically, I'm going to start with who am I? I'm a consumer. I'm an advocate. And I'm a dispenser. So being a consumer, as I said, I'm born and bred in Dublin, in Ireland. I have a hereditary hearing loss, which is severe in the low frequencies and is profound in the high frequencies. And I've had this from the age of about 6 or 7 when my hearing loss started. And the audiogram you can see on the slide is what my hearing loss is at the moment. I've worn a hearing aid since the age of 12, and I eventually plucked up courage to get a second hearing aid about sort of 12 or 13 years ago. I went through mainstream school and college, and so my next slide kind of shows me, well, I'm also a consumer advocate, but it's just going to be a sort of brief CV of my life. I started my training as an accounting technician, and I moved to Scotland after qualifying because I couldn't get a job in Dublin because there was a lack of jobs and I didn't have experience, and I couldn't get a job to get experience. So I was living on the west coast of Scotland, which is the Mull of Kintyre, and some of you may be familiar with the song, Paul McCartney's song, The Wings, The Mull of Kintyre. And I don't know if you remember the video of it. It was filmed on a beach beside my grandmother's house, so it was kind of a home away from home. And it still is a place I'm very fond of. Anyway, moving on, when I returned back to Dublin in 1997, I became more involved with the Irish Hard of Hearing Association. And I was elected onto their council, where I served there for 6 years before resigning to concentrate on my studies as an audiologist. I also became involved with the National Association for Deaf People, and they're now known as Deaf Hear. And that was when I was trying to attempt to set up a group for young hard of hearing people called Young Action on Hearing. NAD, as was their shortened name, approached me to see if I would join that team, and I'm still with them 13 and a half years later. And in that time I've progressed from being a clerical administration to a community resource officer, and then to being an audiologist, which I now combine with my role as a team leader for our Dublin South Resource Centre. So that brings me on to my next slide, as being a dispenser. So I originally started training to become an oral rehabilitation therapist because one of my colleagues in the office was actually training people to be lip reading teachers, etc. But I found the role of a teacher didn't really suit me. I was more technically minded, and I more problem solving, sort of working with one-to-one. So I kind of thought, hearing aids and testing people's hearing, that sounds good. And when I mentioned it to my boss about becoming an audiologist, he said, definitely go for it. So I started my training as an audiologist in 2002, and I qualified in 2005. And this happened to coincide when we opened a new deaf hear office in sort of southwest Dublin. And having a blank canvas for the office meant that we could actually, and we had funding at the time, we were able to have a purpose-built audiology booth. So at that time, I kind of started to test our clients' hearing. And then it was in about 2 years ago that Deaf Hear decided to start dispensing hearing aids. And I will come on to the reason why we do that in a couple of slides' time. Now, just briefly, a little bit of background to who Deaf Hear are and what they do. Well, Deaf Hear is a unique organisation in the deaf sector, in the fact that we provide a range of services for over 32,500 deaf and hard of hearing people and their families annually. It also has a wider impact of all deaf and hard of hearing people in Ireland through advocacy and campaigning for improved health and education services and for better access to society for all. So, this brings me back to why did Deaf Hear start dispensing hearing aids? Well, clients have been coming to us in our resource centres over the past number of years saying that they've spent 4, 5, 6,000 euro, which would be the equivalent to $6,000 to $8,500 on hearing aids, and they found they were no good, and they ended up being in the drawer. When they would have gone back to their dispenser sometime later in exasperation to see if they could be changed, they usually were told, "I'm sorry, but your hearing has gone down. You're going to need a more powerful hearing aid. More money to be spent." A lot of time they would also say to us when they came into the office, "I wish I had known about your services earlier." And the other thing is that a lot of the clients who did come into our offices were coming in to buy assistive technology. But when we went to look at their hearing aids and find out if they had telecoils, they didn't have telecoils, and they couldn't use half the devices that we had on offer. So it was really frustrating for us as a service provider. So that's why we went into dispensing hearing aids, was to go into competition with other hearing aid suppliers to try and bring down the costs, to show that you can provide good quality hearing aids at a reasonable cost, and to show that we can provide the services by listening to what our clients need, not what the audiologists sort of think is the best for the client, but what the clients really want. So what our hearing care services offer now? Well, basically it's an all-in-one stop shop. You get a free hearing test and a careful explanation of your hearing loss. You get hearing aids to match your lifestyle and budget. You get information on grants available. You have staff who understand what it's like to live with a hearing loss. I'd say at least a third of all the staff nationwide are either deaf or hard of hearing themselves. You're also linked in with our assistive technology service, our Au.D rehabilitation classes, individual and or group support, and much, much more. So basically, we're a sort of person-centred approach to our services. So whatever our client needs, we will do the best to provide them. So just giving you an example of the typical hearing aid journey that a client who would come to me, what they would be experiencing. Okay, I would first meet the client and I would take a case history. How long have they had the hearing loss? Is it hereditary? What are the medical factors involved, if any? I then have a look in their ears to see how healthy they are, or if they have any wax, or if they need referring to a medical specialist. I then do tympanometry just to check the pressure in the ears, or adjust the pressure to see how well the eardrum and their middle ear mechanism are working. So combining with the audiology, the audiogram results gives me a clearer picture as to what kind of hearing loss my clients have. And I then do the hearing test. When we finish the hearing test, we go back into our sort of quiet room where we can sit down, and I would give them a clear explanation of their audiogram. And I usually have their audiogram on a piece of paper and another piece of paper beside it which you can actually see through, but it has coloured lines on it. So that'll show their sort of where their hearing is within the normal limits, a mild limit, moderate limit, and severe and profound. So they can see which parts of the hearing are mild, moderate, severe, profound. And I also use a sort of speech banana. Again, a speech banana is on a piece of paper that you can see through. So I place this on top of their audiogram so they can see what sounds they can hear without a hearing aid and what sounds are missing. So what it's like that, for example, most people who begin to have a hearing loss, they would sort of first complain it's in noisy situations. So they hear the energy of the voice is fine, but they're not hearing that sharp sound, the sounds like the S, the T, the K, that would help discriminate sort of speech sound in noisy places. We then have a look at my client's lifestyle in terms of their listening environments. Have they a very active lifestyle? Do they go to bingo? Do they go to theatre? Do they go to concerts? Or are they just sort of, maybe in the older range group when they just have family members over and watch a lot of television? Or are they still in a working environment? Do they attend a lot of meetings? We then select a hearing aid style that would suit them, based on their audiogram results, based on their lifestyle, based on their dexterity. How well are they going to be able to handle the size of the hearing aid, the buttons and the controls? And then, what is their cosmetic preference? Do they want something really small and invisible? Or are they at the stage, I just want to hear well, so that we can get everything in, all the Telecoil functions and different memories in, and the style, the cosmetics isn't as high a priority. So the hearing aids that we offer can range from sort of small IICs, which is what the term now is invisible in the canal, or CICs, that's a completely in the canal hearing aid. The RIC is a receiver in the canal. It usually has a very fine tube, and then you've got a small piece that just goes behind the ear. And I quite like fitting the RICs because they're comfortable to wear, you don't feel your ear is blocked, and they now have the Telecoils in them as well. And if they have a moderate or greater hearing loss, cosmetics are less of a priority. So they might be offered sort of an in-the-ear hearing aids or in the canal hearing aids or behind the ear hearing aids. Again, it's the client's choice, and I will explain the choices to them. And finally, we look at the technology level within the hearing aids. So this is where the price is associated with the technology. So if they just need a very basic hearing aid, then we can go for the sort of the cheaper technology range that will still be sufficient for their needs. But if they have a very active lifestyle, if they're outside a lot, attending concerts, attending meetings, and they can afford it, then we move up the technology range. But this brings me on to Telecoil. To T or not to T? Many of my clients have not heard about a hearing loop or Telecoil before they've come into deaf hear. So they find, well, how do I explain it to them? So this is the way I describe it. It's like listening to a radio in the kitchen, and then you go and you plug in a set of headphones and you listen through the headphones. The sound becomes much clearer because there's no distortion due to the reverberation of sound off the hard surfaces and no background noise, etc. And I know in one of the presentations yesterday, Juliëtte played an example of listening through in the church through the PA system and then through the Telecoil. And I really liked that because that was good. So that's something I'd like to use in future. It's quite difficult to explain to somebody when they have no idea what a Telecoil is or what a loop system is. Where there's a Telecoil available in the hearing aid, I always order it and I always program it. So unless somebody wants an IIC, an invisible in the canal, or a CIC, then they're going to get the Telecoil. And I've actually, to be quite honest, I've never fitted an IIC or a CIC because most of my clients want to be able to hear and want the Telecoil function. I usually just program it as a sort of a Telecoil only. Quite often with my hearing aids I have 4 programs I can program up. And I usually program the Telecoil as being Telecoil only as opposed to microphone Telecoil. Partly from my own experiences that when I want to use a loop, I want to use what's coming through the loop only, not through the microphone. And for most of my clients, I think they're kind of happy with that. But I might need to investigate, trying MT on some of my clients and maybe having 2 programs. 2 hearing aids are always better than 1. And it gives you a better directionality of sound. It helps you hear better in background noises, which I discovered when I eventually got round to getting a second hearing aid. But it also means that you can have 1 hearing aid on your Telecoil and 1 on normal if you're in that sort of situation. I know that in some of the modern hearing aids you can have the touchless Telecoil setting for the phone. But I find, well, what good is that if you attend a conference or if you're going to the post office or to the bank? And the manufacturers hate my hand going up when I'm at one of their conferences. What about the Telecoil? Even I was very tempted to put my hand up this morning when a couple of the manufacturers were up there. I resisted, but I might get back to them later on. This is a common question that we get when clients come in. Do you have a Telecoil? Huh? What is that? The modern layout of hearing aids makes it more difficult to tell if a Telecoil is fitted when visually looking at somebody's hearing aids. With the old hearing aids, you had the M, the T and the O. You could tell straight away if there was a Telecoil and if it was on the Telecoil. Now you just have a button, and we as community resource officers, when the client comes in to try out an ALD, an assistive listening device, we don't know if they've got a Telecoil. So off comes our watches and we go through the button, and then when if somebody says, oh yeah, here, tick, 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 I know they've got a Telecoil, and then we can proceed with that. And sometimes we get the comment that, oh, I thought that was the off switch. Well, that's how well some of the audiologists kind of train their clients into the functions of the hearing aids. I also find that if somebody does have a Telecoil in their hearing aid and they go into a church or they go into a conference or somewhere and there's a sign that says there's a Telecoil in place, but they're sitting there, they think they've put on the Telecoil, but there's no sound coming through. I say, well, look, take your watch, put it up to your hearing aid, and if you can hear the tick, 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 you know your hearing aid, you're on the Telecoil function. But maybe the volume is not turned up on the loop system, it's not turned on, or it's not actually in place, even if it is advertised. And I'm just going to finish my presentation with a story that one of my hard of hearing friends told me. So one hard of hearing friend of mine told me recently after she'd been to a funeral of a very close friend. I arrived at the church and not looking forward to the occasion, sad as it was, but knowing that I wouldn't hear a word. When seated inside and once the service had started, I reluctantly activated the Telecoil, knowing, as is often the case, that there will be a dead sound, pardon the pun. But, lo and behold, I could hear very clearly and distinctly every single word the priest was saying. My husband, on leaving the church at the end of the service, commented, I couldn't hear a word that man would say. He just mumbled and mumbled. I joyfully replied, I heard every word. Well, that completes my presentation. Maybe not quite what you were expecting, I'm not sure, but if you have any questions, I think we have a little bit of time before Juliëtte and Pat do their presentations.
I just wanted to ask you, you said that you normally, when you have a hearing aid and you have 4 different programs, you use a Tcoil on one of them. Do you have a standard on what you try to use on the other 3 programs? In other words, do you use directional on one of them as a matter of course? Do you use music on one of them? Is there some kind of a standard you use?
Mostly when I'm starting off with my client, if it's their first time in, I program the first one as normal, the second one as a restaurant party, which is a directional program, and I kind of ask them maybe about the third one being music or theatre distance. Theatre distance works very well for people in meetings or when they're in a situation like this and they want to hear a little bit further at the back or in a bingo hall. But I kind of tell my clients, look, my room's quiet. It's not an ideal environment. It's only when you're going to go back out to your own environments that you're going to know what's working for you and what isn't working. So when they come back to me about a week or 2 weeks later, they kind of then let me know, oh, I really like this. I've been using this program more. And we use that information to then, either reset the programs or change them around, depending on their...
So essentially, you use 1 for normal, 2 for, not necessarily this order, but 1 is for normal, 2 is for directional, 3 is for a telecoil, and 4 is kind of the user's choice, depending on what his interest is. I usually on the hearing aids I usually have 4 being the Telecoil, because there's a function of mine where you can have a push and hold. So that if they're using the phone, you push and hold and it gets straight through to the Telecoil. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question about the fitting time. How long do the fitting time in your center for the client when they receive a new hearing aid?
When we started doing the hearing aids, I had battles with my boss with how much time I was spending it, but I kind of stuck to my guns. When I'm doing an initial assessment, which is the case history, the testing, and explaining about the hearing aids, picking the hearing aid, I usually allow an hour and a half, because it depends on my client, how much information they're taking in, getting the chance to answer questions, and for me to answer them. The fitting usually takes about an hour, to get it right. Sometimes we'll probably finish before then. Other times it might go over the time. It depends on the person involved. And then the follow-ups, again, it depends very much how much changes are needed. Anything between half an hour to an hour. But it's all about the communication sort of process with the client, making sure they get the time that they need.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. But my question is more about how long is the try-out period that the client can take the new hearing aid?
Okay. I usually bring them back 2 weeks later. So it gives them 2 weeks to get used to the hearing aid. Then they come back maybe another 1 to 2 weeks later. Now, in our organisation, we have a 60-day money-back trial, money-back guarantee. But if I'm getting a lot of problems with the hearing aid or with the client, we kind of usually are flexible and go over that. I haven't had any problem with so far the hearing aids I've fitted this year. I haven't had one return. So I would do my best to get to the source of the problem if that's the case. But the toll is a 60-day money-back guarantee from the date of fitting.
In the European standard is written that the tryout period can be 2 months. But in the Netherlands, we say, the country from where I'm going, we stop the fitting time or the tryout period when the client is be happy. Yeah. That is the most important.
I suppose at the end of the day, that's what we do. We just have it on paper that it's a 60-day guarantee.
Is there a standard with regard to the rehab that's provided for the customer that's getting the hearing aid to make sure that they fully understand how to use the Telecoil? Last week I had a gentleman who's had 2 hearing aids for 5 years, thought he was deaf in his right ear, but he was walking around with the Telecoil turned on and never knew how to use it.
I would go through all the programs with my client before they leave the office, and I will go through them again on the second and the third follow-up. So we'll ask them how they've been getting on with each of the programs. So I haven't come across that problem with my clients, but we've had a lot of clients come in who've thought that the Telecoil was their off switch. Okay, I think that's my time up, so I'm going to pass over to Juliëtte.
I would just like to know how many of you were at my presentation on Friday. Or maybe I should say how many of you were not at my presentation. I'm hearing feedback. I have a few handouts left from the presentation on Friday. So if you took one, don't take one, because I don't think I'm going to have enough. On the first page is a handout for how to advocate for hearing loops if you are a consumer. If you're an audiologist, I have that same handout for you. Just email me and I'll forward it to you, how to advocate as an audiologist. Then on the second page, I have a description of how Lula Touchette and Loretta Butler from HLAA, or the HLAA group, advocate for hearing loops in their community. And I just copied it and put it in the handout so that you can read it and see what other HLAA groups or advocates are doing. For those of you who are not good at writing advocacy letters, they are extremely powerful. I can't say enough. And I just put 2 samples in of how you can write an effective advocacy letter. And on the third page is a letter from you, the consumer, to your dispenser or audiologist to try and get them in the loop. And they're my words. Please rehash them and write them the way you would like them to be. And then as you continue in the handout, here's my American Academy of Audiology handout. And this is very much directed to audiologists, how they can get in the loop, what efforts they have to do to get this going. And there is a paper in here on comparison between Bluetooth and Tcoils. This morning somebody wanted to know, what's the difference between streaming? This handout was prepared for a great debate between Bluetooth and Tcoils, and so there's a lot of information in there. And then if you're an audiologist, these 2 pages are handouts that you can use in your office. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have handouts, because you may deal with these MT and T switches and programs, and my clients come back to me and they tell me the loop didn't work. The loop didn't work. And I'm going, the loop works beautiful at that church. She was pushing the volume control louder. And it beeped, you bet. But it was the volume beep. It wasn't the program beep. I had to meet her in church, and we finally figured out what it was that she was doing wrong. So this handout, you have room here to write your notes and to write your explanations. And in my office, on the back, I list all the hearing loop installations. So you immediately tell them where to go, where they can use them. I circle them. And in the beginning, if they were Methodist, I would send them to a Methodist church. If they're Catholic, I'd send them to a Catholic church. Some of my clients would drive 45 miles to go and try a loop. So that's the handout. And then I thought I would circulate these. Again, getting the word out is so important, so that this is an example of a women's magazine, the kind that you find in the back of the grocery store. They're kind of free, they're glossy, but they had an article about looping. And something that has not been discussed at this conference, the hearing loop, the HLAA and the AAA hearing loop survey. How many of you completed that survey? Okay. Well, these are some of the comments from loop users in their own words, what they say to others about the hearing loop. And I think you should just kind of glance over them. And then this is an example of a church bulletin. And I support the churches with giving them information, what to put in the bulletin. So if you're a loop installer, contact me. I'll be happy to provide you with the information. But to educate the House of Worship members what to do in a loop. So if you want to pass those around. Okay. So I already asked this question, how many of you are audiologists? How many of you were here before? And how many of you have never heard in a hearing loop? There's a couple of hearing aids floating around. I'll be happy to lend. Do you have normal hearing?
My Telecoil is not turned on.
Your Telecoil is not turned on. I have different hearing aids with me, so if you wanted to experience, you can do that. And I'm going to get a little bit technical for the audiologists here, but there are different measurements in the ANSI standard, and it took me 2 years to fully understand this. And I think if I'm having trouble understanding the standard, I think there's a lot of audiologists who look at a spec sheet but really or look at the numbers and don't really understand what they're looking at. But in the ANSI standard, there is something called the STS, which is the Simulated Telephone Sensitivity Test. But it's a number. It's not a graph, it's a number. And as you know, with averages, you can have a really good number, but it may not represent the speech frequencies. And it is done in a horizontal way with a simulator set for telephone use. Okay? Then there is also a TLS, the test loop sensitivity, where the Tcoil, again, is measured, but now in a vertical way. And a positive number, so if you're looking at a spec sheet, and I believe it's Phonak, they will list it as a number. So if it's a positive number, it means that the Telecoil spits out a stronger signal for the loop than for the microphone. So you'd be looking at numbers that are positive. I have seen some specs where that number is minus 12 decibels. That means that if you turn that hearing aid on in a loop, it's not going to be loud enough. And sometimes that's because the Tcoil is horizontal in the hearing aid. So it has a very good STS number, but not a good TLS number. So when you are a consumer, you need to ask your audiologist, and you really need to hammer on this. And it's a great test to find out if your audiologist is willing to dive into this and to find out the information that you're looking for. But you need an average, you need to remember that this is a number and not a frequency response. So when a Tcoil is chosen, the Tcoil response needs to match the microphone response very, very closely. Now, this is an example of a manufacturer where the Tcoil response and the microphone response are very, very close. They overlap. And it has been measured at the same input level. So it's a 60 decibel input level and a magnetic field of about 31.6. So this Telecoil would give you a good response in a hearing loop. But there's other considerations. We talked a little bit about how to activate that Tcoil. And for hearing loops, you'd need a non-automatic Tcoil. And automatic Tcoils were the manufacturer's response to make it easy for you to hear on the telephone. All you have to do is pick up the phone and switch the Tcoil over. The clients that I tried this with complained heavily because if they would scratch their face and they moved the telephone, then it would go back to microphone, and then it would go back to Telecoil. And so sometimes the hearing aid would beep, even just with very small movements. Then the manufacturer told me you need to put a magnet on the telephone. Well, some of my clients have 6 telephones in the house, or they would have to run to a particular telephone to make this work. So you need a manual Tcoil. You also need Tcoils in both ears. Now I see most of the users here are using behind-the-ear hearing aids. But I know that with some manufacturers, the Tcoil is an added expense to the dispenser. So frequently, as an audiologist, they say, what ear do you use on the phone? And if you say right, then your audiologist may only order 1 Tcoil, not 2. All right? You also need to tell your audiologist or your dispenser what your needs are. Are you going to use it in the loop, or are you going to use it on the telephone? With the telephone, if you have an amplifier, you can make that signal louder, and Linda this morning showed how the telephone can be held a certain way to still get a relatively good signal, but in the loop, you don't have a choice. The signal goes up and down, so your Tcoil needs to be orientated the same way. And do you have special needs? I have clients who belong to a church where they listen to a lot of music. And his complaint was that in the Tcoil mode, the music sounded tinny. So we ended up linking his Telecoil program to the music program in his hearing aid. And all that programming takes a fair amount of time. It takes sometimes 3 or 4 visits to get that just right. So, there's a quiz for the audiologists here. What position was this Tcoil measured in? You know, right now the specs don't show if it was at the hot spot, you know, the strongest response, if it was in a vertical or in a horizontal field. Also, there's quite a bit of difference between these 2 responses. So your audiologist needs to know when they look at a spec, how is the Tcoil measured? And in my opinion, the Tcoil measurements should be done vertically so that it'll work well in a hearing loop. And you need a Telecoil that has a matched response to the microphone. And here are the equivalent numbers. The average hearing loop, and I know Connie was talking about 400, but the average hearing loop is set at 100 milliamp per meters with peaks that range up to 400, and that's the dynamic range. That happens to be 70 decibels. If the input level on the microphone test is used at 60 decibels, that equates to 31.6 milliamp per meters. And if it's measured at 50 decibels, then the equivalent Tcoil input level should be 10 milliamps per meter. This took me a while to fully understand this. So, note the big difference. Is this a bad Tcoil? Not necessarily. And the reason it's not is that the manufacturer is using an input level of the microphone at 60 decibels, but they measure the Tcoil at 50 decibels. That's why there's a big difference. So here's my little red line. If you add 10 decibels to that particular frequency response, you're going to see something very clear. The Tcoil is louder than the microphone in this particular hearing aid. And I use this hearing aid a lot, and I've gotten rave reviews in hearing loops because my clients can't believe how well they can hear in a hearing loop with these Tcoils. Well, yeah, they actually give a little boost in the loop over and above the clear signal. So now the red line and the dark black line have an equivalent input level. You've seen this slide before. This is a unitron test. This is my preferred measurement. If there's any manufacturers here, I'd love to talk with them. And there's the 70 decibel input level and the 100 milliamp per meter level. And these are the same measurements. One is magnetic, one is acoustic. And you can see for the frequencies 500 hertz and above, they pretty well match. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Daniel Putterman study. And Daniel Putterman did a study to find out what's the difference with the performance of a Tcoil versus a microphone response in a hearing aid. And he measured that two different ways. Now, he predominantly used a Widex hearing aid, and he measured it two different ways. He put the hearing aid in a test box and measured the microphone response, and he put the hearing aid in the test box and measured the Tcoil response. But then he also did the gold standard test, and that's the real ear test, on the client's ear, first using a microphone, an input level, a sound level, and then he used a magnetic level. And there are not a lot of studies out there that have documented this. So the first result is the study in the test box. The blue line is the programmed microphone. The red line is the programmed telecoil. Now, to go back to my slide where I hand drew the little red line in, that telecoil right now is a little bit stronger than the microphone. Okay? Now, and in this chart, he measured the difference between those two responses. And in this particular chart, a lower level is actually better, meaning the Tcoil is louder. On top of the positive numbers mean that the acoustic signal was better. So he just shows that for the speech frequencies, on the telecoil and the microphone in the test box, there was not much difference. But then he did a real ear test. He measured the hearing aid on the ear. And the black line is the microphone response, measured in the ear. The hearing aid turned on, programmed for the person's hearing loss, and the black line is the response of the hearing aid. And then he measured it with the default Tcoil. In other words, the Tcoil was not adjusted. He just switched it over to the telephone setting and measured, and lo and behold, there's a difference between those two lines, but yet in the test box, there was no difference. It turns out, and here are the numbers in the chart, and his conclusion was that when in real ear, that the Tcoil is not as strong as the microphone response. But he didn't equate the input levels. So the input level to the microphone was 70 decibels, but the input level to the Tcoil was only 56.2, which is 65 decibels. So then, if you take off or you add the 5 decibels, now you're going to see that the real ear test matches the microphone response. And I think this is important for audiologists, so that if they look at a spec sheet, and the spec sheet shows that the microphone response and the telecoil response match, that they can safely assume, until there is a special test available, and it's not available yet to measure the response of the Tcoil on the ear, that we can safely assume that those two are going to be very, very close. Now, in programming Tcoils, and I've been programming Tcoils now for 2 years for hearing loops, and I see a lot of clients with beginning hearing loss. And most of you are clients with more severe hearing loss. So for people who have mild hearing loss, I only program the Tcoil on, not the microphone. And I have found that some of those clients are extremely happy with performance in hearing loops. Frequently, manufacturers will say to me, well, for people with mild hearing loss, they really don't need a Tcoil. They can hear okay on the phone. But we're not talking about the phone. We're talking about hearing in a hearing loop when the signal-to-noise ratio is not very good. And people, even with mild loss, really, really appreciate that Tcoil. If there is a closed mold fitting, I almost always program a microphone and telecoil in one ear and a Tcoil in the other, so that when the husband and wife go to church, I ask who sits where, and they always sit in the same place, you know, always on the right side or always on the left side. So then I program the microphone for the spouse, but I turn the background noise off on the other ear. And I do quite a bit of tweaking in background noise. And here's my big request to manufacturers. I was standing next to a gentleman who gave a presentation about cochlear implants in a hearing loop, and he had his remote control, and he said, "Oh, I can just change the ratio." And he flipped on his remote, and he turned the microphone sensitivity up, he turned the Tcoil sensitivity up, and I'm going, I want this. I want this in hearing aids. We don't have it yet, but that's what I want. And I mentioned earlier how I link programs to music settings. I also like remote controls because it allows people to switch programs simultaneously instead of having to hunt for the button. I very much like hearing aids with voice prompts. I believe Starkey hearing aids now have voice prompts. Widex hearing aids have voice prompts. I think they should be universal. It's a lot easier to remember Telecoil or music than it is 3 beeps. Yeah. Because if you're very hard of hearing, sometimes you can't hear the difference between 3 and 4. I run into that all the time. And I was in the performance for Wicked, and because I had an open ear mold, there was so much background noise that I couldn't hear the beeps in my hearing aid. So I didn't know if I was in the Tcoil program or not. Now, verifying the Tcoil and how to verify the Tcoil, consider the Putterman study. So if you're confident that the Tcoils that you are ordering, this is for audiologists, if you're confident you're ordering the right Tcoils, you can be pretty sure if you verified the microphone response in the ear that the Tcoil will match this very, very closely. You can measure the Tcoil in the test box, but then you have to kind of wiggle it to make sure that your hearing aid is in the vertical position. I certainly wish that the test box manufacturers would make this a lot easier. I think the first thing to do if you want to start looping, you have to loop your waiting room and get your waiting room looped to about 100 milliamp per meter sound field or a magnetic field so that you can take your clients into the waiting room, because hearing is believing. I force my clients to go into the waiting room. I force my clients to go to church and to try it before they say, no, I don't need a Tcoil. And then as a user, you know, the question is, does it sound loud? Does it sound clear? And that's why I made a comment over lunch. It was loud. I could hear Connie speak, but I could hear the clipping in the hearing aid and it wasn't clear. So obviously something had to be adjusted on the sound system. Now, for those of you who don't have a hearing loop, I've done this when I take my hearing aid fittings off-site. All right, I take a pocket talker, I use the neck loop, I talk at about a meter distance to my client, I speak in a louder voice, 70 decibels, that's the level that the loop system uses, and then I set the volume on the pocket talker between 2 and 3, and I switch the hearing aid to Tcoil, and I switch the hearing aid to microphone, and those levels should be about the same. And there's a very quick and dirty measurement system of a Tcoil with a loop. So my Tcoil Wishlist, and this is a big one, and I've communicated with some of the manufacturers. I really, really would love to see in my NOAA fitting software what exactly I'm adjusting when I'm turning the gain up or down in Tcoil mode. And I would like to see the response referenced to 70 decibels. I want to be able to adjust them independently. I can't do that yet. I want the vertical Tcoil as the default setting. This morning or yesterday was somebody in the Doug Beck presentation. Was anybody in the Doug Beck presentation yesterday? Somebody asked, well, are you telling me that the Tcoil response only goes to 3,000 hertz? It does if you set it for the telephone. But if you set it for the loop, in that particular manufacturer, it broadens the response. So if your Tcoil doesn't sound good, you need to find out how it was programmed. I would love to see a simple real ear test to measure Tcoils, something that I can hold or put on a chair that allows me to measure the Tcoil right in the ear. And I want the manufacturers to educate audiologists, because I believe that audiologists are somewhat hesitant to dive into hearing loops. They can't see this. They don't know how to measure this. And once that they see their clients coming back, for those of you who have seen the response sheet that's circulating with how people like the hearing loops, they will dive into this and they'll never go back. They'll never look back. But we need to kind of help to nudge them, and the manufacturers can give them the tools in the CEU classes. And my big wish list, I want a Tcoil that works in every direction. Because this morning somebody said to me, I can hear, but I gotta look this way for me to hear. And I'm not smart enough to know what's wrong with this Tcoil. I hear a lot of complaints of people saying if I bend my head forward, I hear better. If I look up, I hear better. But if I look straight ahead, I don't. That has to do with the orientation. Just like my radio on the AM radio doesn't pick up very well. It's the same idea. But you need to be told about this. You need to know about this when you walk out of your dispenser's office. And last but not least, I think with appropriate programming, that electromagnetic interference can be eliminated in hearing aids. And there it is. Are there any questions I can answer?
If I ask my audiologist to program my Tcoil for a loop, will that give me some additional gain when I use my Tcoil on the telephone?
Most likely it will not. For those of you who've used hearing aids for a long time, it used to be, I tell my clients, flip your hearing aid to T, or find the T switch, turn up the volume, and hold the phone behind your ear, okay? Because those Tcoils were not pre-amplified. What you're asking me is you're making a case for really having two different programs on your hearing aid. One for telephone, where we boost the volume a lot in the mid-frequencies where the telephone gives you the most sound. And then another one with a much broader response and less volume that matches the needs for your hearing loss for in a loop. But so sometimes it's easier to get an amplified phone and hold your phone a certain way than it is to be in a loop and have your hearing aid set too loud. One more comment about telephone use. More and more manufacturers are now going to wireless transmission for telephone use. That means if you push and hold a button and you hold the phone, it goes into an acoustic phone program, but it sends that signal also to the opposite ear while turning off the microphone automatically. So now you hear telephone in both ears, and that sometimes improves the fidelity, the understanding on the phone.
Is that Phonac's Zoom function?
I think Phonak has it. I know Widex has it. Starkey? Unitron. I don't believe Audicon has this, but that's because some of the manufacturers are really moving to these intermediary, these streamer devices that broadcast sound from the phone to the hearing aids. But if you don't have that type of technology, until then you may need 2 different programs in your hearing aid.
I can't agree with you more about educating audiologists to educate their client, because and while you were passing around that order of service from the church, it says, well, if you turn on your Tcoil, you will be able to access the loop. As a cochlear implant person, the idea of 2 Tcoils is something new to me. If you have your churchgoer going into your church, which we do in mine, and this is in New York, okay, so the things are reasonably au courant in New York, and you tell the people, well, just turn your hearing aid to Tcoils, and they are clueless. They are, what's a Tcoil?
Yes.
And like someone's not picking up the ball here.
No, and there are so many different parties involved. There's the audio-visual guys who don't know hearing aids. It's the audiologists who are not educating their clients. The churches don't know that people like you have trouble hearing in church. And I'm really trying to bring all those groups together. But I think that every hearing loop, what we've called hearing loop dedication, the first few times when a hearing loop is turned on in a church, it requires inserts in the bulletin. It requires an audiologist or a dispenser to be there. And I frequently stand up in the front of the church. I identify myself. I will be there to answer any questions you may have about your hearing aids and Tcoils. And at every service we do, at every church that we have looped, people come up to me and ask questions. And they go like this: do I have it? And I'm so relieved when I can see a button on a hearing aid, and I recognize a make, and I go, yep, you have it. All you have to do is get it turned on. It's so delightful. I get emails from people saying all I had to do was get my Tcoil turned on. So I think there are definitely some audiologists who may have been answering their clients' requests for smaller hearing aids, and they may be somewhat hesitant to start working with hearing aids or with hearing loops because half of their hearing aids don't have Tcoils. But I've faced those patients too. And I've been very honest about this. It was an aha moment when I heard Dr. Myers speak, and from that moment on, I made my clients write their name in blood if they didn't want a Tcoil. So I also have these loop cards. If you didn't pick up a stack, take them, drop them off wherever you go where you can't hear.
I'm the president of the New Jersey State Association, and we work collaboratively with various agencies in the state, AAA being one of them. How much does your organization reach down to the actual audiologists in the state? So if we wanted to network with them, would they know what we're talking about, that the AAA is partnering? Can you answer that for me?
You're going to talk about that. Good.
For the last 2 years, I've been traveling from state to state to state. I think I got to 15 last year and 10 this year. So that leaves me half of them to go. But they are excited about it, they're involved with it, and all of them know about it. But sometimes people have their priorities wrong. And they say, well, right now we're focusing on, maybe they're sunsetting their licensing, and they're really busy, trying to keep that licensing regulation the way they want it. So nag, I would highly encourage you to nag. And some, like It sounds like the New York one, and also I know in Florida, where are my HLA, my people? There they are. Okay, my HLAA people in Florida and our Florida Academy of Audiology, we're like this. We're very, very tight. And so I think I'd love to see that in others. So I am promoting that, definitely. But sometimes you have to nag. So let me just see. Most, if not all of you, heard about the Let's Get in the Hearing Loop last night. If you didn't hear it last night, you heard it sometime earlier this week. So the tools that we have available right now, we've been working very hard, the Hearing Loss Association and the Academy, working very, very hard since February 2010. We do have a brochure, you've seen it, it was in your bag when you checked in here, on assistive listening devices. The American Academy of Audiology has handouts on telecoils, on overall assistive listening devices and looping, and they are made to give to the audiologists to give it to their consumers. So we're hoping that those will get a lot of use, but again, I'm going to have to nag. My husband will say I will be successful because I am a 4-star nagger. So we're working on that bit by bit. We also have the Proud Supporter logo, which businesses and other entities can say, we support this, which is great. And then we also have a presentation available. It is available now online at the audiology.org. And any of you, not just audiologists, any of you can download that. It's also going to be on the HLAA website. It's just that right now the HLAA is revamping their entire, what is it called? Website. Thank you. My students have so much fun with me. And it does show that I'm the oldest president that the Academy has ever had. I'm proud of it. However, anyway, my students are always having to guess, what is the word? What is the word? So now you get to play it too. And the winner is Flo. Anyway, the presentations are great because you can we have a what we call a static version, so it's not going to change. It'll just play and you can have it and whatever, but we also have a version where if you want to tweak it, if you want to put in your logo from New Mexico, for example, you'd be able to revise it and use it. And there are also, for those of you who are like, I'm really into looping, but like me, you really don't know all that much about it, there also are a lot of talking points there too, separately, so you'll be able to download all of those right now. Where can you find the tools? Well, on the Audiology website. So you will get copies of these. These will be available to you. But if you want to jot it down now, it's just the audiology.org resources consumer. You'll actually see quite a few things on that website besides looping too. And then the HLAA is a little harder to find. And they do have their Au.D brochure at this point, as well as their Telecoil brochure. But again, Brenda, you think she maybe has been a little bit busy for the last, just a tad. So she is going to see to it that that website is changed, and then things will be much more accessible for you. This is just a very quick run through some of the samples. You saw this one, you have this one. They're also, it's very hard to read, and I don't expect you to read it. I just want you to see that this is the kind of thing that we have, that we give to audiologists now, that they can download and then they can share it with their consumers. There's another one on assistive devices, and then there's another one on looping, explaining to the patients what looping is. And then also you'll be able to download the Proud Supporter. So you may want to go, any of you, let's say if you live in, Kalamazoo, Okay, why not? Kalamazoo, Michigan. You may know a lot of places there. They might be dry cleaners. There might be all kinds of things. Let them know, you know, that they can support this by just putting up a sign in their store windows, and it gets the word out to people like, what is a hearing loop? What is that all about? This is just the Academy website where you can download the PowerPoint presentations. We also have a number of tools that are still in the works, and Brenda and I thought that we could end our campaign for looping by the end of this event that we're at now, and we realize we're probably going to be doing this the next 5 or 10 years, at which time, before then, we're probably going to have something that can do better than looping and telecoils. But for now, it's looping and telecoils are the best, the most versatile, most affordable, and it goes on and on. So we're going to keep working on this. We are working on research data showing the benefits, because manufacturers, it's one thing for us to say, oh, my patients are so happy, I can hear so much better, but they're going to say, show me the data for it. So we've got some data collected and we're analyzing it now. Also in progress with, I think with Connie Anderson and with Juliëtte. Oh God, I'm telling you. Give me multiple choice. No. Anyway, they are working on finalizing the looping standards certification test. That's going to be extremely important for people to know. We also have a looping advocacy and information sheet that the HLAA has been working on. And then we still are producing, it's almost ready, the one-page sheet on looping and telecoils for audiologists too. Because we want the audiologists to educate their consumers, but right now we realize we need to do a little education of audiologists also. Why get involved? Because it's not just a benefit for your patients or your consumers. It is a huge benefit for the audiologists. If they would just realize how much more satisfied people will be with their hearing aids and cochlear implants if they're able and understand how to use these telecoils and loops. And as you know, I can just skip this, you'll be able to read all of this, but there's so many reasons why patients would benefit. But why should the audiologists get involved with this? Because people are going to love you. Your patients are going to love you. They're going to tell probably 10 of their best friends. When they don't like you, how many of their friends do they tell?
Everybody.
Yeah, everybody, everyone across the whole state probably. So your folks will be so much more grateful if you are serving and providing the highest quality skills and things for your patients to really get the maximum use of their assistive devices. It also benefits the patient or the audiologist. They won't have to spend a lot of time talking about how are you going to get along in a noisy place of worship, for example, because you're going to have to spend less time counseling them if they have gotten their place of worship looped. For those of you audiologists who haven't started yet, I would say your very, very first step is to get your waiting room in your practice looped. This gentleman was just a fabulous World Cup curmudgeon. Okay. Oh my gosh.
You get those too?
Oh yes. He was not happy about his hearing aids and this, that, and the other. And so then we said, okay, we're going to have you try the hearing loops and in our waiting room, and look at that smile. I asked him, can I use this? He goes, go ahead, and then he was grumpy again, but no. He said, fine. So, you know, this is what we want, blissfully happy patients. So obviously, if we could get our, I don't know, our curmudgeon, I just like that name for him, that would be good. And he knows that I call him a curmudgeon. Anyway, this I'm not going to read to you. I assume you all can read in here. Pardon? Oh, it's in the handout, in your handout? Perfect.
This was put together for audiologists who say, gee, I'm really interested in all that they've been telling me about this initiative, but I don't know. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to get started. Well, here it is. It's just page after page of first you do this, next you do that. And it's extremely clear. And so I'm just going to skip through it. But this Linda Rimmensnyder is also one of our audiologists on the looping initiative. And she and Juliëtte are just the strongholds of that. They are just experts, both of them. They've gone to town. But I want you to read the very last part here, testimony. Well, I'll just read it to you real quickly. But she said, as testimony to the value of looping and telecoils is, she says, Alan Davies, she asked permission to use his name, not our patient. Linda's got a very huge private practice, a number of them actually in Chicago area. She says, Alan Davies, not our patient, but a member of my church for the first time in decades, was able to hear the entire service while sitting in the choir loft. He then received a personal hearing loop for the TV from our practice in gratitude for his favorable comments that I used in my initial loop publicity and mailings, because Linda just got started on this after mentoring by Juliëtte. After becoming accustomed and spoiled by the improvement in audibility, Mr. Davies then instigated hearing loop installation in his facility's residential gathering room. He recently switched his allegiance to our practice for all professional services. So see how this can benefit you. And if you happen to be one of the audiologists in Chicago who served this gentleman, my apologies, but this to me is the kind of testimony we see when people are given that kinds of services we've been talking about for the last couple of days. So we can continue now with questions, because we really do have two experts here. I'm just an advocate, a cheerleader, but these two are really the experts. Okay, questions?
I want to thank you for your hard work. As an HLAA member and a chapter, we have used loops. We have used loops for years, and we love them. People not in HLAA or in our groups don't have Tcoils. They don't know about them. The audiologists don't tell them about it.
Right. Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck.
Right. And just a couple of comments there. Because if you don't have AV guys trained to do hearing loop installations, that's one of the things you absolutely have to do, is reach out to AV engineers, because this is a business opportunity for them. Then I suggest you reach out to audiologists who are somewhat more mature. You're not mature. You look so young. But this is what happens when you're fresh out of school. You think that, all you have to do is put a hearing aid on somebody's ear and you're going to make them hear. But as you've been in the field longer and longer, you realize the limitations much more. I'm much more vocal about this. So if you reach out to perhaps 2 or 3 practices, a private practice only, rather than somebody in a very busy medical clinic who will not have time, who is at the beck and call of the physician, doing testing, here, doing audio, they're not going to have time. But the private practitioner, I believe, is going to recognize the value of this kind of, if you want to call it marketing, branding, establishing a name. I tell you, everybody in the Fox Valley knows me. I've been in every church. Okay, I stand in front of those churches. And so in the month of December, I think 7 or 8 of my hearing aid fittings were directly related from people coming to me. They heard me speak in the church, and the husband said, you need to go see her. Okay? And so for the audiologists who work for manufacturers, they know those audiologists. Ask them. You know, if you have a Widex hearing aid, if you have a Starkey hearing aid, if you have a Phonak hearing aid, they know those audiologists. So you may want to reach out to manufacturers' representatives, AV companies, because you're going to need installers who can do the proper installations, and then the audiologists work with the AV installer. So once the hearing loop is installed, the audiologist is there for the dedication. Because the AV guy doesn't know one hearing aid from another. All right? And the people who don't have Tcoils, and I've run into them, I tell them the truth, that they need to go back to their audiologist. When I first started looping, they actually took hearing aids back. They took hearing aids back that were a year old because I was so adamant about this. And they gave me full credit, and I fit my clients with hearing aids with Tcoils. But I have to say that probably 75 or 80% of all my hearing aids already had Tcoils. So it made that switch a little bit easier for me. But you know, search out the ones that are, you know, I think I've given you enough information. Yeah, okay.